Welcome to another Thought Leaders from Joosr. I'm Darren Boyd Annells, and I'm pleased to be joined here today by Gary Luffman from Think.Change.Consulting. Gary's a specialist and expert in the application of neuroscience and psychology for learning and change. So how can organisations best use neuroscience for learning and change?
One of the most essential things would be to understand a little bit more about the gatekeeper for information. There's too much information out there, and if you can't get past this gatekeeper, you're not going to be doing any kind of learning development or affecting change in any kind of way. And neuroscience does know about a gatekeeper and how to kind of get around it, which is fantastic. The other end of the scale is, how do you change people in the long term, or how do you change yourself in the long term? And neuroscience offers up some really very simple and essential kind of steps that if you do these things, there's a very good chance that the brain will adapt and change for the long term.
So I think it's quite important to understand how the brain works in the context of learning. Can you talk us through that some more?
Okay. Probably the first place to start is just how limited our brain is in terms of the information it can take in and what it can do with that information, which is, some of the estimates would suggest about 80% of what we do in a regular day will be governed by habit, which is really quite challenging for us.
That's quite scary, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't. I talk about this a lot to organisations, and every time I think, really, am I really just 80% kind of robot? But it's kind of coming back to this idea of how limited our capacity for thinking or taking in information is. We have to find routines, okay, and we get regular activities become governed by these habits, so that our brain can predict what is likely to happen in the future, and it knows what to do, and that's why we continue to do it in a very similar way. So in terms of, we've got limited processing capacity, we have to have habits, there's no getting away from it. Sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. And I think that's also a bit of a stepping off point for why people maybe find change difficult. So there's something around past experiences and expectations for the future that will have a really big impact. At a very fundamental level, our brain has invested a whole heap of cognitive resource to help us do things in a regular way, or deal with situations in a regular way. When change comes along, it says we need to dismantle some of that stuff, we need to put some cognitive resource into developing a new connection, and our brain is going to be looking for, well, convince me why, because that takes effort, and actually I'll probably treat external change as more of a threat, and the brain's more likely to be change averse than kind of up for it.
So why do we have to consider both learning and change when we think about the science?
I'd say that they're inextricably linked. Change doesn't happen as sometimes we might envisage it. An organisation doesn't change, a whole heap of individuals have to change and adapt. And individuals at a very fundamental level, what they're doing is connecting neurons in a new way and dismantling other ones maybe. And at a very essential, fundamental level, I should say, that is what is driving any kind of change or learning. Okay, you can't take the two apart. Change is a result of learning.
Some people change better than others, don't they? The book Mindset by Carol Dweck, she talks about two fundamental mindsets, the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And I can see that people with a fixed mindset might find learning and change more difficult than the others. Why is this the case?
If you have a fixed mindset, the description from Dweck is that you'd feel that you have a finite capacity or amount of knowledge, skill, intelligence. And once you bump up against that, you wouldn't feel that you could extend it. So often when change comes about, it may be that kind of that feeling that you're going to be exposed as not as good as you are, or you can't take on this new process, system, whatever it might be. And that could be quite an anxiety-producing feeling that you're about to be exposed, as opposed to a growth mindset. They would feel that whatever I have, I could always improve and build on and adapt it.
So, for example, at Joosr, we've curated content around topic areas like management and leadership, and we've been very careful to select a number of titles on topics rather than just relying on one title that might be the most popular. And I understand that's quite good for learning, and the term that I hear a lot is neuroplasticity, which is quite hard to say, but probably even harder to understand. Can you just demystify that a bit for us?
Okay. I'll explain what it is, and then we'll try and work out an analogy that might make it easier to conceptualise. So neuroplasticity essentially is the brain's ability to rewire itself, to connect new neurons that are being used more often, and disconnect ones and dismantle that resource, the ones that aren't being used. So the process is long-term potentiation is joining together, and long-term depression, nothing to do with being sad or blue, is dismantling pathways that aren't being used so much. So that's how it rewires. But the way I kind of conceptualize neuroplasticity is, if you think of riverbeds, let's use that. A riverbed will control the flow of water, just like neurons will control the flow of thoughts. But we also know with a riverbed that over time, the way the water flows will affect the riverbed. Just like if you think in a certain way, will affect the way neurons are connected up or dismantled. So much so that you will connect up new tributaries or connections, or dismantle old ones that are less used. So that's probably a good explanation of what neuroplasticity is. How it was used within the world of Joosr. I think that idea of having a range of things really helps people to continually revisit a topic, but in a very interesting, novel way, as opposed to, I'm not likely to keep reading the same book over and over again. I might once, twice, maybe 3 times, but if I have a range of books, but all in a very similar area, it starts to build a much richer picture in my mind, so that I can understand how I might apply things, think differently maybe. But I think there's something about the novelty factor that's probably quite useful.
I mean, in terms of learning in the workplace, every day we're getting bombarded with so much information, aren't we? There's just overwhelm. Texts, emails, webinars, a lot of companies have mandatory training, group meetings, team meetings. There's a lot there, and we've got to try and squeeze in learning around that as well. So the brain's trying to cope with a lot of incoming information, and that doesn't necessarily make learning so easy. So what's a good way for the brain to learn?
Well, if we start off by looking at how the brain deals with that deluge of information, because there is too much, so it has to filter out what is going to be most pertinent to myself. So there's a very particular structure, it's called the reticular activating system, or RAS. It starts in the back of the brainstem, and it kind of spreads out across all areas of the brain. And it's kind of like a gatekeeper. It's working out, is this information important or interesting? And if it's not ticking those 2 boxes, it doesn't make it past there, and you will not focus your attention on it. Once we start talking about the RAS, you can then start talking about a how-to guide, as it were. So there's almost like a tick sheet that you could produce to get past that gatekeeper. So things around, does it satisfy a need? Is there some personal focus from this information? Is there some sense of challenge, variety, novelty involved? All of those things will help the RAS say, yes, this is important and interesting, and allow that information through. So I think any learning, whether it be for you personally or for an organisation trying to develop its people, thinking about, well, how are we presenting this information? Is it kind of ticking some of those boxes or going against them? Because if you can't get that information into the brain, forget about kind of affecting the brain in any long-term sense.
At Joosr, we decided early on to make our learning tool about bite-sized content, and bite-size has become a much more important topic recently. Why is bite-size so good for the brain and the way it learns?
I think it's always good to have a variety. So there's lots of different ways of presenting things to people, and I'd say that's probably a good place to start. If we've picked on bite size, as you just mentioned, I think that idea of you have limited capacity, maybe limited time as well, to get the gist of something, to get the core most important elements is a good place to start. There's something about the ability to use it in a timely manner. So as opposed to going to a hotel for 5 days and being filled full of lots of facts and acronyms and 2x2 grids, if you've got something that you could use as you go into that meeting, or you're about to prepare a communication or something along those lines, and you have something quite short and sharp, that timeliness becomes really useful. And there's something about the self-directedness as well, so you could just dip into things that are most relevant to you. And you're actually ticking a lot of really good boxes in terms of how to get past a very particular gatekeeper in the brain. So there's something called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. It starts in the back of the brain here, and it kind of sprawls out throughout the different brain regions. And you should be thinking of it as a gatekeeper. It's working out, is this important or interesting, this information? Because we get presented way too much information than we can cope with. And to get around this RAS, some of the things that it will respond well to would be, does this information meet a particular need? Is there some kind of personal focus? Elements of challenge are also useful, but also variety and novelty. Those, you could turn that into a tick list of, if we do these things, we're likely to get past this gatekeeper. So some of the things around Bitesize could absolutely help some of that to occur.
If you were leading a learning and development function today, knowing what you do know about neuroscience, what would you be thinking about doing differently?
Often when we talk to clients, we talk about splitting the learning and development kind of offering into 4 key areas. There's architecture, design, delivery and embedding. Once you start thinking about those 4 distinct structures, then you could start to apply the neuroscience within each of those structures. But some of the real quite fundamental things I'd probably be approaching people with is around this idea of flipped classroom. A very Googleable term if you want to find out a bit more detail about it. But essentially it's about, you provide information to a learner before they come to an event. So you're not wasting time offloading information and then consuming it. You're actually then in a better position of similar levels of knowledge, but you can start to discuss, critically evaluate and start to try to apply. So having something like a Joosr guide to something or a book along these lines would be a really useful stepping off point maybe for getting people up to a very similar level. So that flipped classroom idea is probably really useful. There's something about getting away from thinking that you can just put people in a room, fill them up with some information over a day or 5 days and that's it. There's something around interval repetition or stage repetition, sometimes it's talked about. So you do things before, during, after. You do it over a more protracted period of time. And what you're doing is you're convincing the brain that by keep revisiting this stuff and exploring it at the right level of depth as well, that it's important enough to put resources together to help make that more sticky, I guess, easier to do. More often, there's something about depth of processing as well. It's very easy as a learner to turn up at an event and have someone talk at you, and the idea of consuming knowledge as opposed to constructing knowledge. Getting people to think about how would you apply that, what might be the obstacles, can you apply it to this situation? That forces them to think far deeper and start to construct as opposed to just consume information. There's no substitute for application, so allowing people time to practice in the safe environment, setting up some quite simple kind of opportunities to apply some of this stuff, really important. And then reflection. More often than not, we're so busy doing, we get through whatever it is that we are doing and then we're on to the next thing. And we don't tend to take some time to incorporate, well, how do we reflect on this? If we were in the L&D community, we could be planning that into our delivery so that people have opportunity to think about how did it go? What went well, what went less well, what could I do differently in the future? Again, we're just convincing the brain to keep revisiting a concept or whatever it is that we're trying to adapt, and convince it that it needs to put resources together to help make that stick.
Today we've been looking at science, learning and change. I've been joined today by Gary Luffman of Think.Change.Consulting.
Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thank you for coming. I'm Darren Boyd Annells from Joosr. Check out Joosr.com and I look forward to seeing you on the next Thought Leaders. Goodbye.
Available on iPhone and iPad. Download the app today.